Through the darkening evening, the air shook with humid heat, and a thick, almost palpable peace enveloped the narrow streets of the suburban neighborhood. Officer Braden, a sturdy man with a hard stare and manners that left little room for doubt about his sternness, drove along his usual routes. He'd long had it in his head that if you didn't look like the locals, you were definitely up to something. Suddenly, the headlights of his patrol car caught a figure walking along the curb. The man, dressed in a simple sweatshirt and jeans, was anxiously checking his cell phone, as if expecting an important call. His steps were quick, as if he was in a hurry but didn't know which way to go. That was enough for Braden. "Let's see who we have here," he muttered, slowly moving the car toward the sidewalk. The man didn't immediately notice the patrol car turning toward him and flinched when he heard a sharp siren blast. At first, he just stopped, but when he saw the officer get out of the car, his face tensed. "Hey, you," said Braden, as sharply as if the man in front of him were already guilty. "What are you doing here?" "Just going home, officer," the man replied, trying to speak calmly, but there was a note of confusion in his voice. "Home?" There was mock disbelief in the policeman's voice. "I don't think so. Why are you walking so fast? Are you hiding something?" The man looked at him in bewilderment. He didn't have time to answer before Braden stepped closer, too close, invading his personal space. "Give me your ID," the officer demanded, not even trying to hide his arrogance. The man pulled out his wallet, but his hands were shaking. The gesture elicited an instant reaction from Braden. "Hands up! Slowly!" he shouted, putting his hand on his holster. "What? But I just—" The man started, but his voice was drowned out by the noise of the command. Braden spun him around to the car and pressed his face against the hood. "You're hiding something, right?" the officer continued, going through the pockets of the detainee. "Come on, confess. Who are you? What did you steal?" "I have done nothing." The man tried to object, but his words were drowned in the officer's contempt. The assembled passers-by began to stop, pulling out their phones. A few people whispered, but no one dared to come closer. Braden knew his actions were being recorded, but it didn't bother him. It was routine to him. The man in front of him, however, was not ready to give up so easily. His eyes were filled with fear and humiliation, but also with pride, with a desire not to break despite the injustice that had come upon him with such force. It was that expression, that look, that was the beginning of something bigger, a flash that would soon engulf everything around it in a fire too bright to ignore. The crowd began to gather like moths to a light, attracted by the loud voices and flashing lights of the patrol car. There was tension in the air. Officer Braden kept pushing, as if he enjoyed demonstrating his authority. His words flew through the air like lashes, making everyone who heard them uncomfortable. "Face down! Hands behind your head!" he shouted sharply, as if the man in front of him were a dangerous criminal. "Please, this is some kind of mistake." The man tried to object, but his voice trembled. "A mistake? We know mistakes like that." Braden smirked, grabbing the man by the shoulder and dropping him to the ground with force. The dirt from the curb settled on his clothes, but that was far from the worst of it. Passers-by began to stop a few meters away from what was happening, pulling out their phones. Some found it fascinating. Others were afraid to intervene for fear of becoming the next victim. Whispers echoed through the crowd. "Why did he detain him?" an elderly woman asked. "He was just walking. Nothing suspicious," someone replied. But no one moved. Everyone stood as if mesmerized, not daring to intervene. The man, lying on the ground, could feel the wet mud seeping through the fabric of his jeans. Every look at him was like a needle digging into his soul. He couldn't see faces, but he felt judgment, as if he were part of a show where he'd been predetermined to be the villain. "You think we're just standing here? You think I don't know why you're out here?" Braden continued, walking in circles around the detainee like a predator. "I look at you, and it all makes sense. You're going home, aren't you? Maybe you've already cleaned out someone's house." The man remained silent, clenching his teeth to keep his emotions at bay. Any word could be a weapon against him. "Get up! Come on!" Braden shouted, lifting him sharply by the collar. The man tried to get up, but the policeman pushed him back down. "No, on your knees, where everyone can see." Many of those gathered had already started recording video. Smartphones were raised high, but none of the spectators came any closer. Even those who knew it was wrong didn't have the courage to intervene. "Look at him," Braden said loudly to the crowd. "This is what real trouble looks like in our neighborhood. Walking the streets, looking for something to eat." Some in the crowd began to talk, but the silent majority continued filming. Messages on social networks were already flashing on their phones. "Another case of police brutality. Look what's going on." But no one was in a hurry to act. The man, still on his knees, felt drops of sweat rolling down his face, mixing with the dirt on his cheeks. But something new began to grow inside of him, a rage that came from humiliation. He knew he couldn't stay silent any longer, but he was constrained by fear. Suddenly, a voice came from the crowd. "Hey, leave him alone. He didn't do anything." Braden turned around, his face twisted with anger. "Who said that? Who here wants to be smart?" He looked around at the crowd, and there was dead silence. That moment was a turning point. There was a movement in the crowd, tentative but inexorable. People realized that they saw something wrong, but no one dared to step forward. The man raised his head, his eyes meeting the cameras. He didn't know if there would be justice, but he knew one thing for sure. This moment would change everything. Before we continue, let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're hearing our stories from and whether you've encountered something similar in your life. Your thoughts and experiences are important to us. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next exciting stories. Now, back to our story. "Well, let's see what we have here," Officer Braden said coldly, digging through the pockets of the man on the ground. His hands moved quickly and confidently, like a man who knows exactly what he's looking for, or what he was going to find. The man tried to protest, his voice shaken with a mixture of anger and despair. "I haven't done anything. You're violating my rights, right?" Braden smirked, not raising his eyes. "I'll tell you your rights when you stop being a threat to this society." A second, another, and Braden raised his hand in triumph, clenched into a fist. A small plastic bag with something suspicious inside glistened in it. "What have we here?" He said it loud enough for everyone in the crowd to hear. "Drugs? Do you really just carry that around with you?" The crowd gasped. A few people began to whisper about what was happening, while their phones continued to capture every detail. The man, still lying on the ground, turned around, his eyes widening in horror. "It's not mine. I don't know where it came from. You planted it," he shouted, trying to get up, but the officer pinned him to the ground again. "You planted it? Really? That's your defense?" Braden squinted, looking directly into the detainee's face. His voice grew quieter, almost a whisper, so that only the man could hear him. "No one will believe you. You hear me? No one." The crowd began to slowly divide into two parts: those who were beginning to doubt the officer's actions, and those who were still silently accepting his words as truth. "We also have an update," Braden continued, taking a step back and pulling out his walkie-talkie. "You know this guy fits the description of a suspect in a convenience store robbery nearby?" Yeah, black hoodie, jeans, about this tall. Is that a match? I don't think so." The detainee rose to his knees with difficulty, his voice louder, trembling with rage. "It's a lie. I was in another place. Check the cameras, talk to the people." But Braden, not paying attention, continued to dictate details into the walkie-talkie. "Yeah, I found him here. He was acting suspicious, resisting. I suspect he may be armed, waiting for backup." The crowd began to buzz louder, people exchanging growing doubts. One of the spectators, a young guy with a baseball cap, stepped closer, holding his phone at face level. "Hey, officer," he said loudly. "What the hell is this nonsense? We can see everything. He didn't do anything until you guys started messing with him." Braden turned around, his eyes narrowed. He took a few steps toward the boy, forcing him back a little. "Don't you have anything else to do? Go home if you don't want any trouble." But the young man didn't back down. "I'm going home. I'm just going to take this video with me." Braden froze for a moment, then turned back to the detainee. "Okay, we're done. Pack 'em up," he said, pulling out the handcuffs. The man felt the cold metal on his wrists, and something in his mind snapped. He knew that now he was going to be accused of all the deadly sins, and no one in this police department would even try to get to the truth. But somewhere in the crowd, the first sparks of resistance had already begun to emerge. People realized that what they had seen left no room for doubt. This was a gross, open abuse of power. The man, with his hands shackled behind his back, looked at the crowd. He didn't know if there would be those among them who would dare to speak for him, but one thought was already pulsing through his mind. This story wasn't over. The cold light from the neon lamps flooded the stone walls of the station, making them even more menacing. The man was led into a small room with a metal table and a chair bolted to the floor. The handcuffs clicked and his wrists were freed, but only physically. "Sit down," Braden said briefly, standing in the doorway. The man sat up, trying not to show fear. His eyes darted around the room, searching for a camera, for the slightest hint that someone was watching. But there was nothing, just a cold emptiness. The door closed with a thud, and Braden was not alone. Two other officers entered the room, silently glancing at each other. Their facial expressions were equally cruel and indifferent. One of them, tall and massive, placed a folder on the table. "So," he began, opening it, "we have every reason to believe that you are a threat to this city. The evidence speaks for itself." "What evidence? You fabricated the whole thing," the man exploded, his voice hoarse but determined. Braden smirked, stepping closer. "You're accusing us of lying? That's brave. But you don't have the right to speak now. You don't even have a lawyer, and guess what? You won't until we decide you're willing to cooperate." The man looked up, his eyes blazing with anger. "This is illegal. You can't keep me here without a lawyer." The tall officer leaned over the desk, staring into it. "Look, buddy, it's very simple. You either admit you've been where you shouldn't have been, or we dig deeper. And when we dig, we find everything we need." Braden stepped closer, leaning on the table. "Do you realize no one will believe you? You're just a statistic. No one would even notice if you disappeared." The man's heart was beating at a frantic pace, but he held on. "You're afraid of the truth. That's why you're doing all this. But the truth will come out." "Really?" Braden snorted. "Tell me, who's going to believe your truth when we already have witness statements? Surveillance cameras with your face on them? It's all there, kid, so stop playing the hero." One of the officers standing in the corner suddenly spoke loudly. "Maybe it's time to show him how we work with the stubborn." The words made the blood freeze in the man's veins. Braden nodded silently. "Stand up," the massive officer ordered sharply. The man stayed where he was, his body tense as a taut string. "I will not play by your rules." At that moment, the massive officer grabbed him sharply by the collar and yanked him out of his chair. The man hit his side on the table but managed to stay on his feet. "Last chance," Braden hissed. "Either you start talking or we'll show you what resistance is." But the man, despite the pain, raised his head. His voice sounded firm. "Do what you want. But when this is over, everyone will know the truth." The words sounded like a challenge, and the room fell silent, filled with tension. Even the officers froze for a second, not expecting such a response. At that moment, the door ajar, and someone's voice from outside said, "Have you seen this video? It's everywhere." Braden turned around, his face contorted with anger. The man across from him smiled through the pain. "I told you, the truth always comes out." It wasn't the end, but the first crack in the system had already made itself known. "You're just stalling," Braden said glumly, watching the man breathing heavily as he leaned against the cold wall of the interrogation room. "Admit it, and we might go easy on you." The man was silent, clenching his hands into fists. His face was tired, his eyes empty. But inside, everything was boiling. Every minute spent here was taking away what he feared most of all to lose. "You don't even know what you're doing," he finally said, his voice low, almost broken. Braden smirked, taking a seat across from him. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing. You seem to be wasting my evening. Why don't you tell me what you were trying to hide? Or should I explain how our system works again?" The man raised his head sharply, his eyes glittering with anger. "You don't know anything. You think you're playing some kind of dirty game of your own, but you have no idea what the consequences are." Braden leaned closer, his voice almost a whisper. "What are you hiding in there? Come on, surprise me." The man was silent for a second, then his voice cut through the tense silence. "My daughter. She's 5 years old. She's dying." The words sounded like a clap of thunder, and for a moment the room seemed to freeze. Even Braden, with his usual contempt, looked a little stunned. "What did you say?" he said, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. "She has a rare disease," the man continued, his voice shaking, but he didn't stop. "I was in a hurry to get home because her condition had worsened. I had to pick up the medication. Time was running out, and now I'm here because you decided to play hero." Braden grinned, but his gaze became intense. "Nice try at sympathy. But you know what? Every criminal has his own sorry story." "It's not a story," the man interrupted sharply. "It's my life, and if anything happens to it, it will be on your conscience." The room fell silent again. Braden exchanged a glance with the other officer, who stood in the corner, arms crossed. Their confidence shook for a moment, but they quickly returned to their usual methods. "You think you can manipulate us with this?" Braden stood up, his voice hard again. "Even if it's true, it doesn't justify your actions." The man rose to his feet, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "You don't even know what I've done, but you've already judged me. You took away my chance to be there for my daughter when she needed it. That's not the law. That's not order. That's indifference. At that moment, the door opened again and an officer from the corridor shouted out, "The warden wants to see you both. Something to do with this detainee." Braden threw the man a parting look of annoyance and walked out, slamming the door. The man was left alone. His hands were shaking, and he felt anger and despair overwhelm him. He thought of his daughter, of her face, of how she could ask, "Where is Daddy?" These thoughts were tearing him up inside. Beyond the walls of this room, another battle was already beginning. Videos of his arrest were circulating online, garnering millions of views. The story was starting to get out of the precinct, but for him, it all meant one thing. It was too late. He closed his eyes, and tears burst from them despite his strength. He could only wait, pray that this tragedy would not be the end of his family. That night, as the man was thrown into the cold cage of the precinct, another man thousands of miles away sprang into action. His name was Marcus Reed, and he was an activist known for his implacable fight against injustice. His name often made headlines for exposing police brutality. Marcus was no random passerby. He was at the scene of the arrest not by chance, but because he had long followed the doings of the local police department. When he saw Officer Braden pinning the man to the muddy ground, a warning light went off in his head. "They're doing it again," he muttered, picking up his phone and turning on the recording. Marcus's video was clear and candid. It captured every detail: how Braden planted the evidence, how roughly he treated the man, and, most importantly, the indifference of the crowd. All the chaos spoke for itself. A few hours after the man was taken away, the video appeared on the internet. A caption appeared under it: "Another case of police brutality." How long will this go on? Marcus knew that videos like this could either become an explosion or get lost in the flow of other news. But this time, something went differently. The first comments were standard. "This is disgusting. When will it stop? The system only protects its own." But then an avalanche began. People started sharing the video, mentioning major media outlets, well-known activists, and human rights organizations. In a few hours, the video gained millions of views. Marcus sat at his computer, watching the number of reposts, which were growing at a breakneck speed. Soon, journalists started writing to him, asking questions about the place and time of the incident. "I was there," he answered into the phone receiver, looking at the monitor. "Yes, I took it all down. The man was innocent. He was arrested for no reason, humiliated and slandered." The morning after the video was published, local TV stations began hyping the story. At first, cautiously, with reservations, but soon, when additional testimonies of other eyewitnesses appeared, the news flow turned into a real storm. In the station where the detained man was being held, the excitement began. Journalists were ringing off the phones demanding comment. The department's management could not ignore the commotion. "What the hell is going on?" the captain bellowed, bursting into Braden's office. "It's just people on the internet." Braden brushed it off, though his face was pale. "We'll figure it out." But the captain picked up a tablet with a video playing. "It's not just people. This is an explosion. If we don't figure this out, we're all going to be accused of a cover-up." Meanwhile, the man, still in isolation, began to notice changes. For the first time ever, a lawyer, a young but confident man, came to see him. "This isn't over," the lawyer said, looking into the man's eyes. "We have a chance. The internet is already on fire. Now it's up to us." At that moment, the man felt a faint spark of hope light up in his heart. He didn't know how it would end, but for the first time since his arrest, He had the feeling that his voice would be heard. Meanwhile, outside the precinct, a storm was brewing. People began to take to the streets demanding answers. They were holding placards that read, "Justice for everyone. We see the truth. No systemic injustice." That was just the beginning. The truth was beginning to come out, but with it came all the dirt that had been hidden for so long. Before we continue, let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from and whether you have faced something similar in your life. Your opinions help us better understand what's important to you. Also, don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with our new stories. And now we continue. The city, usually drowning in the daily hustle and bustle, shuddered as a wave of anger rose ever higher. The video of the arrest, shot by Marcus Reed, went viral. Millions of views turned into millions of comments, and each one was drenched in rage and a demand for justice. The internet lit up with hashtags calling for action. Number Justice for All, number Hands Off the Innocent, number Racism in Law. Local TV stations could no longer ignore the case. The anchors opened the evening newscasts with footage of Officer Braden roughly pinning a man to the ground while the crowd filmed his actions on their phones. Journalists began digging deeper, and soon the first articles about the long history of misconduct in this police department appeared. It was revealed that Braden had previously been caught up in reports of abuse of authority several times before, but each time he was covered up. These documents, which had been carefully hidden from public view, suddenly surfaced thanks to a leak orchestrated by someone inside the department. The articles provided details that made many people's hearts sink. False accusations, fabricated evidence, threats to witnesses. The crowd outside the police department was growing by the hour. People came with placards bearing words that were impossible to look away from. "We demand the truth. Don't cover your own. One law for all." There were loud shouts in the streets, and the atmosphere was heating up by the minute. The situation became so tense that the department tried to take a step back. In an official statement, they said an internal investigation had been launched and assured that those responsible would be punished. But these words only added fuel to the fire. Internal affairs? People were talking in the crowd. It's just another attempt to keep it quiet. We've seen this before. Meanwhile, the man's lawyer, Eric Solzberg, was becoming a real media figure. He gave interviews to several major channels where he said that his client was not just innocent, but was a victim of systemic racism. "This case is just the tip of the iceberg," he said in an interview. "What happened to my client happens every day, just not always on camera." These words echoed throughout the country. Protests that began outside the department began to spread. In other cities, people took to the streets in support of those fighting for justice. Meanwhile, inside the department, the tension had become unbearable. Braden, who had been grinning and confidently pressing the detainee, now sat in his office, surrounded by piles of documents. He felt the ground slipping from under his feet. Every minute he was getting calls demanding an explanation. The management was not going to take the hit. "It's your own fault that all this came out," the captain told him as he entered the office. "Now get out of it." "I didn't start it," Braden snarled, but even he realized the situation was out of control. Soon, new details surfaced. Activists involved in the case began to publish testimonies of other victims of the department. People recounted instances in which they had been unjustifiably detained, threatened, or humiliated. Their voices finally began to be heard loudly. All this was superimposed on growing public pressure. Footage from rallies began to appear on social media, with people standing shoulder to shoulder chanting, "Justice now." Some held up pictures of a man whose life had been turned upside down because of one evening. But the most powerful blow came from journalists who obtained surveillance footage from cameras near the place of arrest. The footage clearly showed that the man had done nothing suspicious. He was just walking down the street, checking his cell phone, when a patrol car approached him. This footage was the final straw. The crowd outside the department became even more determined. City officials, sensing that the situation could get out of hand, began making cautious statements, promising a transparent investigation. But words were not enough for the public. People wanted action. Inside the station, the man who was still in custody learned about what was happening outside. He was told that thousands of people were supporting him, that his story had become a symbol of the struggle. "The people are demanding the truth," his lawyer said as he entered the cell, "and they will get it." But the man didn't smile. There was pain in his eyes. "It won't bring back the time I lost, and it won't undo what could have happened to my daughter." These words burned the lawyer, but he understood. Each step forward brings closer the moment when the truth will prevail. Outside the building, the protests continued. People were not going to leave until they saw the guilty punished. The atmosphere in the city was becoming more and more disturbing, and in this tension was born the power to change everything. The screams of the crowd outside the station window sounded like an inexorable verdict. People demanded answers, unwilling to disperse until the truth was fully revealed. Every hour the protests grew louder, and the police department, accustomed to acquiescence, felt like a fortress under siege. Inside the building, chaos was heating up. Officer Braden paced his office, casting brief glances at his phone, which vibrated with incessant calls. A barrage of accusations rained down on him from news sites, television, and social media. Journalists demanded comment, activists demanded his suspension, and the captain demanded that he settle this as soon as possible. "You got us into this," the captain shouted, bursting into the office again. "You had your chance to do it by the book, but now we're all drowning." "I haven't done anything I haven't done before," Braden said, trying to sound calm, but there was panic in his voice. "It's a common occurrence. These people are just looking for an excuse to stir up a scandal. We have video, witnesses, and now surveillance footage." The captain leaned closer, glaring at him. "Do you realize what this means?" Braden remained silent, gritting his teeth. He couldn't afford to break, but everything inside him was trembling. Meanwhile, the man who was still in custody sat in his cell as if in a trance. It seemed to him that he was in some nightmare that would not end. Every hour was torture, every moment a reminder of how ruthlessly his life had been ruined. He thought of his daughter, of her lying at home, probably asking where her father was. These thoughts tore at his heart. But at that moment, the cell door opened. His lawyer stood on the threshold. "We have good news," he said, his voice firm, but his eyes showed fatigue. "The cameras confirmed that you didn't do anything illegal. You're being released." The words echoed in his head, but instead of joy, he felt emptiness. He knew that the truth had prevailed, but he knew that nothing could bring back what he had lost. When he was taken out of the station, the crowd greeted him with loud shouts. People applauded, hugged his lawyer, and shouted slogans. But he walked in silence, not looking at anyone. His eyes were fixed on the distance, where he hoped his family was waiting. Meanwhile, the department feverishly tried to minimize the fallout. Braden was suspended while an official investigation was underway. But that didn't stop the avalanche. Journalists found witnesses who described how he planted evidence in other cases. Audio recordings of him making crude remarks about detainees surfaced. His reputation, which had been tarnished before, was now completely ruined. He was no longer seen as an officer of the law, but as a symbol of a corrupt system. But Braden didn't give up. In an interview, he denied the allegations. "It was standard procedure," he said, standing in front of the cameras. "I was doing my job like many other officers. These allegations are just an attempt to destroy my career." However, the words sounded unconvincing. The public did not want to hear excuses. People demanded justice and punishment. The man who had finally been released returned home, but home was no longer a place where he felt safe. His daughter, weak and pale, was lying in bed with her arms around her mother. When she saw him, her eyes filled with tears. "Daddy, where have you been?" she asked quietly, her voice weak but full of love. He walked over to her, sat on the edge of the bed, and hugged her, feeling his soul overflow with pain. He couldn't answer. He couldn't explain why he'd been so far away when she needed him most. It had been a long night. He lay awake at his daughter's bedside, listening to her steady breathing. His mind was spinning with thoughts. What would happen next? What would he do to rebuild his life? The next day, he saw the news. The faces of protesters shouting his name. The stories of others who told of the injustice they faced. His story became a symbol, but he had a hard time believing that it could in any way fix what was broken. Braden, sitting in his home, drank whiskey while staring at the television screen. He watched his pictures flash across the screen, accompanied by the words "corrupt officer," symbol of racism and law enforcement. He clutched the glass tighter and tighter, feeling his world crumble. But there was no remorse inside him, only anger. "It's not my fault," he muttered to himself. "They're the ones who ruined everything." But the truth was already on the side of those who fought for justice. And his words were no more than a whisper in a thunderous demand for change. The city was boiling like a volcano ready to explode. Crowds of people, armed with placards and voices, chanted in the streets. Their slogans sounded like a single rhythm, resounding and inevitable. Justice for all. The system must answer, not one step back. The evening air was saturated with a tension you could almost feel on your skin. News headlines rattled, covering every detail. The story of the man who was detained without cause became a symbol of all that was wrong with the system. People talked about his daughter, who was left without medication during those terrible days, about his broken life, about his family, whose faces now adorned television screens and pictures on the internet. The man's family was the center of attention. Journalists besieged their home, with cameras pointed at the mother trying to shield her daughter from the flashes of light and questions. The man tried to remain calm, but every minute pressed on him like a weight, reminding him that his personal tragedy had become a public struggle. The protests, which began with peaceful marches, quickly grew into something more. People were not just demanding justice for one person. They wanted to bring down the whole rotting system. They spoke of the thousands who had never been able to prove their innocence. Those who had lost their families, their jobs, their lives because of impunity and systemic injustice. The police, sensing the growing threat, drew forces to the city's main buildings. Patrol cars surrounded the protesters, and officers in full riot gear lined the streets. But this only fueled the fire. The protesters saw this not as a defensive order, but as further evidence of the suppression of freedom. One evening, the situation got out of control. A crowd gathered outside the police department building where it all began. People held placards with a picture of a man and his daughter, and their voices echoed far beyond the street. "We will not be silent any longer," shouted someone over the loudspeaker. "This concerns all of us," the crowd murmured, picking up the words. The tension was growing by the minute. The officers standing in a chain began to get nervous, their eyes darting among themselves. But when one of the protesters threw a plastic bottle, the situation became more heated. The police moved forward, but the protesters did not retreat. There was shouting and people started pushing. Bottles and stones flew in one direction, batons and shields in the other. The air was filled with the roar of human anger. Meanwhile, a man and his family were watching the whole thing on television. His wife held her daughter in her arms, trying to hide what was happening from her, but the girl saw it anyway. "Daddy, is it because of us?" she asked in a low voice. He looked at her, his eyes filled with pain. "No, sweetheart. It's because people want things to get better." But he knew there was only part of the truth in those words. This had really started with him, with his arrest, and now it had become something more. The next day, he was invited to speak at one of the rallies. His lawyer warned that it would be risky. "You could become an even bigger target," he said. "But if you're ready, it can make a difference." The man pondered for a long time. He didn't want this attention, didn't want to be the face of this fight. But every time he looked at his daughter, he realized he had no choice. When he took the stage, the crowd erupted in applause. People chanted his name, hailed him as a hero. But he didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a broken man who had been dragged into this battle against his will. "I'm not standing here because I wanted to," he began. His voice sounded firm, but inside he was trembling. "I'm here because I had no choice, because I was forced to go through hell, all because the system decided it could break me." The crowd froze, listening to him. "But I didn't break," he continued, raising his gaze, "and none of you have to. We're all here to say enough is enough. We will not be silent any longer." His words spread like flames and the crowd roared in response. The protests intensified, became more organized. People demanded reform, real change. But the police were not going to give up their position. Clashes became more frequent. Social media and the news were abuzz with reports of injured and detainees. The man knew that this fight was just beginning. Nevertheless, he sensed that something had changed. The anger of the community was not just an outbreak. It was a fire that could not be put out. His family had become a symbol, but it was already more than them. It had become a fight for everyone who had ever been humiliated, broken, destroyed by the system. The city, once steeped in routine, was now gripped by a wave of change. And even the most skeptical knew that this anger would not disappear until the truth prevailed. The lights of the cameras blinded his eyes. The crowd chanted his name, but the man barely heard their voices. Every step toward the podium rang in his head like a bell. He was supposed to speak in front of thousands, but all he felt inside was pain and fatigue. Everything that had happened in the past weeks had turned his life into a whirlwind of events he couldn't control. He stepped up on stage, and the noise of the crowd died down. People were waiting for his words, waiting for inspiration. But in this moment, the man felt like nothing more than a man the system was trying to destroy. He sighed heavily, as if that sigh was supposed to push all the weight out of him. "I'm here," he began, his voice quiet but firm. "Not because I wanted to be here, and not because I'm special. I'm here because I was forced to be, because the night I was stopped, my life was turned upside down. He looked at the faces in the crowd. People were waiting for him to continue. He saw in their eyes a mixture of anger and hope. The system tried to break me, he continued. And you know what? It did. I lost my job, my reputation, my trust in people in uniform. I lost the time I should have spent with my daughter when she needed me most. The crowd froze. His words were like knives that cut through the air. But, his voice trembled, but he didn't stop. This system has forgotten one thing. It has forgotten that when it tries to break one, it awakens others. The crowd began to murmur, cheering him on. This struggle is bigger than me. It's bigger than you. It is a struggle for those who cannot shout, for those whom the system has destroyed and whose voices it will never hear. The noise increased, but the man raised his hand, calling for silence. I'm not a hero, and I don't want to be called a hero. I'm a reminder that a system built on injustice must be destroyed. The crowd erupted in applause. The man stared into the distance, unable to see faces, only sensing the strength of these people. He knew that the fight had only just begun. At the same time, something unusual was happening in the police department. The investigation against Officer Braden had concluded, and its findings shocked everyone. Dozens of cases were found where he had overstepped his authority, fabricated evidence, and threatened witnesses. But that was just the beginning. The evidence gathered showed that Braden was part of a larger system of corruption spanning the entire department. Arrests of other officers and even high-ranking officials soon began. Braden, instead of the usual defense of the system, found himself isolated. His colleagues, who had previously covered his actions, now did everything they could to dissociate themselves. His name became a symbol of his downfall. At the trial, he looked like a broken man. His lawyer tried to argue that he was only following unwritten rules, but the court was adamant. Braden received a harsh sentence, and his name was erased from the department's memory as if he had never existed. Meanwhile, the man who had become the face of the struggle returned home to his family. His daughter still needed treatment, and his wife needed support. They tried to rebuild their lives, but knew that nothing would ever be the same again. He continued to speak out, to participate in rallies, to speak to those who faced similar injustices. His name became known throughout the country. He was hailed as a symbol of change, but he refused to accept the title himself. One day, his daughter asked, "Daddy, did you win?" He looked at her big, hopeful eyes, and smiled despite the pain. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I certainly haven't given up." That answer was true. His life was left in ruins, but from those ruins something new was growing, something strong, something no one could ignore anymore. The story ended tragically, but also inspiringly. It was a reminder that even one spark can ignite a flame that changes everything. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you or someone you love experienced injustice or racism? It's important for us to hear your thoughts and stories because every response helps us realize how important this is to all of us. We appreciate each and every one of you and are grateful for your support. Subscribe to our channel, give us a like to support our work, and remember, together we can make a difference.